Now we will do the second part of this lecture, which will focus on the book of Ecclesiastes or Qoheleth. Qoheleth is the name of the book in Hebrew, and Ecclesiastes is the name that is used in the Christian canon for the book, but it actually emerges and comes from the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Qoheleth. I will explain this in the coming few minutes. The meaning of the name Qoheleth, the name occurs about 7 times in the book, and the word is understood to be a call feminine participle of the root kahal in Hebrew, which means to invoke, to convoke, or to assemble. Some think that the name Qoheleth is a personal name that refers to Solomon, and there are problems with that. Is that the name actually is preceded by a definite article, so it can't be referring to a name of another person, but rather some sort of an office or a position, maybe even a character that is designed to be the teacher within the scope of this book. The book is also written from the perspective of the powerless, and there may be some allusions to a royal background, but at the same time, it is clear that the book is actually reflecting something more than just the royal context. Besides, the book is late in its language, which uses Hebrew terminology and some Persian words that come from a much later period than Solomon. So the reference to Solomon is like the same case as we have seen in Proverbs. It's more of a traditional connection between an important figure like Solomon and also an important book like the book of Ecclesiastes. The name, as I mentioned, is a participle, and it appears outside of the book of Qoheleth in Ezra and Nehemiah in order to refer to different offices, either a scribe or binder of gazelles. And accordingly, Qoheleth refers to an office that was related in some way to assembling people, bringing people together to offer them teaching. The Septuagint or the LXX renders the word Qoheleth as an assembly or public gathering in the Greek word ecclesia, which is also used in the New Testament to refer to the church. The book of Qoheleth, when you read it, it seems to be offering contradictory advice or contradictory conclusions about the meaning of life. So sometimes it says, enjoy your life, and other times it says, well, everything is vanity. Other times it says, work is very important, and other times it says, but toil is really useless. So scholars have tried to figure out why the book says contradictory things or contradictory assertions, and scholars have connected this with the formation of the book. So some scholars believe that the author wrote the bulk of the book, but editorial glosses entered at a later time. Another proposal argues that the author cites traditional wisdom and refutes it. A third position argues that the author enters into a dialogue with an imagined character or real. It's kind of like creating a conversation in order to affirm something about the message of the book. Or the book reflects a single author's changing viewpoint over the years, and maybe the book is also trying to capture the ambiguities of life, that there is not a single way of evaluating the meaning of life. The book begins with a title, and then it presents or introduces the main theme of the book, which is an important verse: vanity of vanities, says the teacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And then there is some sort of a reflection on the success of a king of some sort, maybe an allusion to Solomon. Then a reflection on the relationship between human activity and time. Then the life in the society. Then the book talks about the advantage of silence over unreflected speech. Then reflection on wealth. Then the book moves to talk about the experience of life and death. Then the reflection on the wisdom and folly, and then the necessity of taking risks, the necessity of enjoying life, and then the book goes back to the theme of vanity of vanities, says the teacher, vanities of vanities, all vanity, but towards the end of the book. So in chapter 12, verse 8. And then an epilogue that has a very cool verse that all students love to read and they wish that their professors would listen to. I will come to it at the end of the lecture. The language of the book underlines its late date, as I mentioned earlier. There are occasional Persian words, and you know the Persians came to power and contact with the people of Israel sometime after 539 BCE. So a word like Pardes, paradise, it's like a park, is a Persian word, and Medina, which is a province. They are used, and they are signs of being the book being late. Even the Hebrew vocabulary that is used in the book itself, some of it is of a late period, like a word like shalat, to rule, zaman, to reflect time, or the relative pronoun shay instead of asher, that which they are used in the book, which is a sign of its late time. Ben Sira probably knew and used the book about 190 BCE, and which then maybe Qoheleth would be of an earlier period, 250 to 225, so 250 to 225 seems most likely as a date for the book. One of the famous sayings in Qoheleth is found at the beginning and the end of the book. Vanity of vanities, says the teacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. The meaning of vanity, the Hebrew word is hevel, is really interesting because the word could mean varieties of layers of meanings. One is that life is meaningless, so empty or meaninglessness. Vanity could refer to something absurd, something irrational, something unpredictable. Vanity could refer to something that passes quickly. And all of these layers are actually found within the book as the book reflects on the meaning of life. So if the book asserts that everything is vanity, everything is absurd or meaningless or irrational or unpredictable or empty or passes quickly, what is it that remains? In chapter 1, verse 4, the author says, well, the earth. A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. So in some ways, the author is saying that the cosmos does not change much. And in chapter 12, verse 5, towards the end of the verse, it says, because all must go to their eternal home, and the mourners will go about the streets. That is, people will die, and other people are going to mourn them on the streets as it always happens. So it's the cosmos and death endure while humans don't. For Qoheleth, rhythm in the cosmos and the cycle of nature offers no hope or inspiration, and this is quite different than what we read in Proverbs and in Psalm 104, where the rhythm of creation in Proverbs is actually a sign of order and a sign of meaning in life. Psalm 104 talks about that the rhythm in life is a sign of divine interference and the beauty of creation. For Qoheleth, who is reflecting on the meaning of life, rhythm in life and rhythm in the cosmos and the cycles of nature are actually hopeless and they don't offer anything new. Besides, Qoheleth makes the point that no one will be remembered. What is good for humans? The cosmos for Qoheleth is too consistent and God's involvement is mysterious. How would one determine what is good? Is it piety in the Torah? Is it waiting the end of the world and the start of a new world? Is it in nationalism that seeks liberation from oppression? Note that Qoheleth does not mention any of these things. Qoheleth seeks to investigate the human activity and possibly he or she might find something that endures. So the goal of the book of Qoheleth is trying to actually wrestle with the meaning of life. Does life have a meaning? Does the human life have a meaning? Qoheleth, when it reflects on this meaning of life and whether there is something that endures that could give meaning and joy, reflects also in on accomplishments. And I want you to read the end of chapter 2. It's really interesting because chapter 2 talks about toil and work. Does work give humans a meaning? Does work give one a sense of orientation in their life? And it does talk about, how the author of this passage, how they worked so hard, but then there is something absurd about it, because this work will be inherited by someone maybe who doesn't care about it, or maybe this work will be destroyed over time. So is there even meaning in that? And although, like, towards the end of this passage, the author seems to be approaching something about the meaning of life, where the author says, "This also I saw is from the hand of God," as if there is something meaningful emerging here for the author. But then the author ends the passage with, "This also is vanity and a chasing after the wind." So it seems like, as much as the author is trying to find meaning in God's activity in the human sphere, there is still a question about whether this is meaningful or not. Humans also struggle with figuring out time, having control over time, and also understanding the rhythm of life around them. For the sages, time is a key factor in controlling the right outcomes of the actions. And the book of Qoheleth tries to give us a glimpse on that. The author in chapter 3, verses 1 through 13, tried to actually present many of the events that happen in human life in some sort of, there is a time to do this and a time to do that. And in the 14 pairs, it begins with a time to be born and a time to die. So something positive and something negative. But it ends at the end with reversing the order of these in order to end on a positive note, where it says a time for war and a time for peace. So maybe there is a possibility here that the author is also trying to communicate something positive about life. For Qoheleth, only God has control over eternity. Events happen in the life of humans, they just happen. You don't have control over them. God did not reveal to humans how this life and how these events work together. So there is a mystery that Qoheleth is trying to figure out and understand about life. That there is a mystery, and that there is no rhythm and you can't always figure it out, raises questions about the importance of wisdom, whether wisdom is helpful or futile. Proverbs talked a lot about how God is in control, and how God, though God is not mentioned a lot in Proverbs, still God actually is present in the world to do justice and to maintain the order of the creation. For Qoheleth, actually, there is mystery about the divine providence. God is still in control, God is still powerful, but there is a question about whether God is interfering immediately in the human affair, or things don't always have a clear pattern on how God reacts in human affairs. In Qoheleth chapter 9, verse 1, Qoheleth asserts that the wise is in God's hand. That is, Qoheleth, in some verses, is asserting a sense of protection and divine providence. But then in other parts, Qoheleth seems to be saying that God is unwilling to enforce ethical principles. The wicked prosper, and God does not bring judgment on them. And the righteous and the wise seem to sometimes be suffering, and God chooses not to interfere. So Proverbs says there is rhythm, there is justice, you reap and harvest what you sow. Job comes at this and says, well, not true. Job is an innocent person who suffered unjustly. So not all suffering people have done something wrong. Qoheleth comes at it from another angle and say, well, it's even sometimes that the wicked prosper, and sometimes the wicked does not really reap what they do. So there seems to be a conversation in wisdom literature about this cause and effect that we talked about when we talked about Proverbs. For Qoheleth also, the sage continues to question the status of the wise, the righteous, and the wisdom of the wise. In chapter 2, I want to read these verses. It says, then I said to myself, what happens to the fool? What happens to the fool will happen also to me. Why then have I been so very wise? And it goes on to say that the fate of the fool and the fate of the wise is the same. So why should one be wise? This is different than the book of Proverbs that said you should be wise because God is going to reward and wisdom will reward you. That for the sage, it seems like there is a problem here. There is an issue about the unpredictability of the results of human action. There is a challenge in Qoheleth about finding meaning of life or in life. And Qoheleth reflects on the role of Sheol, role of death. Death seems to be one of the consonants that Qoheleth is realizing that this does not change. People die. So is there a way to find meaning in life based on thinking about death and Sheol? Sheol is the Hebrew word for the underworld or the grave. Death is the absolute end of life. There is no existence beyond the grave. Remember, I said the idea of life after death is a late development in the Hebrew Bible. And what is even harder for Qoheleth is that sometimes there is no really distinction between humans and animals. So look at chapter 3, verses 19 and 21. It says that, humans and animals die the same way. For the fate of humans and the fate of animals is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. That's different than your perception that you may have advantage over animals. And chapter 9, verses 5 and 6, it also says something about what happens to both the wise and the fool. The living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no more reward. And even the memory of them is lost. Again, this is a very pessimistic way of thinking and talking about death as the end of life. If this is the case, then, because Qoheleth does not offer a resurrection after life or a judgment after death, therefore, Qoheleth advises the living to live fully. Enjoy your life as you have it now, with its toil and with its joys. As Qoheleth continues to reflect on the meaning of life, Qoheleth talks about the futility of human aspiration. Nothing new. Wisdom brings sorrow, as the wise person Qoheleth says in chapter 1, verse 18. I hated all my toil in which I had toiled under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to those who come after me. That's chapter 2. I'm sorry. I need to read chapter 1, verse 18, where it says, for in much wisdom is much vexation, and those who increase knowledge increase sorrow. Why this negative view of human activity in Qoheleth? Because achievements will be passed on to an heir that possibly an unworthy one. Why achieve things if someone will inherit them and this person will not care about what you have achieved? If the heir is good, time itself will destroy whatever one builds or creates. And sometimes compensation does not really match the toil. This is a very pessimistic way of thinking about human activity that we find here. And even if one accomplishes something, death will inevitably frustrate all intentions and hopes. You could read more reflection on this in chapter 2, verses 18 to the end of the chapter. As you continue to read in the book, it seems like skepticism in the book was toned down a little bit. So, toward the end, the sage offers a more balanced perspective on humanity and life. The author says, "Rejoice, young man, rejoice, young woman, while you are young, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Follow the inclination of your heart and the desire of your eyes, but know that for all these things God will bring you into judgment." So, in some ways, the author is saying, enjoy your life, but realize that there is judgment. I don't think here the judgment is referring to judgment after death, but I think the author is trying to say, as you enjoy your life here and now, realize that God is at work in bringing justice here and now. So make good choices. Be careful. Don't over rejoice and don't over enjoy your life in ways that are immoral. But towards the end of the book, still, even as skepticism is toned down, ambiguity and questions around the meaning of life still remains. This is one of the famous verses in Ecclesiastes, chapter 12, verse 1. "Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come, and the years draw near when you will say, I have no pleasure in them." The Hebrew word translated as creator can be translated in two other ways. It could be a reference to a will, and the will here would be a reference to the womb, so when the human being is born. Or the same word, Beit Aleph Resh in Hebrew, could be a pit, a reference to the grave. And as I mentioned, and in the translation in front of you, it could be a creator. The first two translations, will or pit, underline the mortality of humans. The third one underlines human fear of God. So remember your Creator. So make good decisions when you are a young person before the days of trouble come. And remember that you are mortal. Remember that you are born and you will die. So that when you're making decisions in your youth, remember that there will be days of trouble when you are older. So make better decisions when you are when you have power and valor as a young person. The fear of God in Qoheleth entails a sense of terror of a God who directs and determines the fate of humans, sometimes in mysterious ways or ways that humans cannot really figure out. Here's the last slide, which I promised to show you at the beginning of the lecture. In chapter 12, verse 12, it says, "Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh." And I know because you have written a lot for this course, you do wish I would take this verse seriously, but I would say nice try. This verse is very important, but for you, not for the professors. Anyway, I want to finish with a pastoral reflection on the meaning of the book of Qoheleth. As I mentioned, the book seems to be quite different than many of the books of the Bible because it actually creates room for skepticism and for pessimism. It raises questions about the meaning of life. So imagine yourself as a pastor, as a chaplain, as a peacemaker. When you encounter so much suffering in the world, when you encounter so much pessimism and skepticism about justice, about peace in the world, realize that there is space for you in the Bible to express how you feel. How you feel about your work, how you feel about joy, how you feel about questions around the futility of life or the fragility of life and the meaning of life. And read these chapters as an invitation to be honest, to reflect sometimes your doubts, to reflect sometimes your questions about the meaning of what you're doing. But at the same time, as a pastor, as a leader, as a mentor, I encourage you to create spaces for individuals in your churches who are experiencing depression, people who are experiencing bipolar experiences in their life. Sometimes they are very happy, other times they are very sad. You can use this book and these chapters as a way of inviting the people in your church to learn how to express their feelings. People in the church don't always have to be happy. People in the church don't always have to be uplifted and joyous and in a celebratory mood. But they can also express their skepticism, their suffering, and even questions around the meaning of life.